No yelling, no chaos, just policy and a paper trail you could frame. My boss tried to bury my work, steal credit in meetings, and push me toward the door. I did not fight louder. I wrote things down. I followed the handbook the way a map follows roads. What happened next was not a scene. It was a sequence. Calm emails, clean receipts, an outcome so tidy it fit in a promotion. I work in a mid-sized company where the carpet is quiet, the coffee is free, and the most dangerous thing in the building is the way power pretends to be polite. I was hired into a role that sits between sales and operations. My job was to catch the handoff, clean the numbers, and make sure the promises we make to clients can actually be delivered. I like clear lanes. I like checklists. I like leaving the day with a list of boxes that are honestly checked. When I started, my boss seemed impressed by that. She called me thorough. She said I asked good questions. She wrote that I would go far here. I saved those messages without knowing how useful they would become. The first month felt normal. I learned the names that matter, and the rooms where decisions have already been made by the time they reach the calendar. I studied the handbook like a textbook. There were sections about documentation, conflict resolution, and the ladder you should climb when something is off. There were also sections about credit and collaboration. They were written in careful corporate language and boiled down to a simple idea. If it is not in writing, it is hard to prove. If it is not on the shared drive, it is hard to trace. I set up clean folders, named things sensibly, and kept my sent mail neat enough to audit. Then the tone shifted. My boss began to redirect my work into her inbox before it reached the shared channels. She would ask me to send drafts to her first for quality control. The drafts would sit. A week later, the project would be presented as her quick turnaround. When I raised my hand to add context in meetings, she would say, "Let us not get lost in details," and move on. She told me that enthusiasm is important, but leadership is about owning the room. She said if I had a point, I should brief her first so she could steer the message. I thought I was learning office politics. I thought this was mentorship, if a little sharp. Credit began to slide off my hands. A process map I built over a weekend showed up in a deck under her initials. A client email that I wrote word for word was forwarded to the executive team with her line that she had drafted a response when I brought it up gently. She smiled and said, "The team wins together." When a mistake appeared, the tone changed again. Suddenly, the "we" became "you." You missed a step. You confused the fields. You did not copy the right person. I checked the logs and saw that my original included the correct fields and the right names. The edit that introduced the mistake had come from her. I breathed. I documented. I sent a calm note with the trail. She replied with praise for my attention to detail and a reminder that I should route drafts to her first. The hours began to stretch. Meetings that could have been emails took the late afternoon and spilled into the evening. Tasks labeled urgent appeared right before I put on my coat. If I asked about priorities, I was told to be a team player. If I stayed late and delivered, there was a new standard. If I pushed back, I was called rigid. I kept a simple log in a private document. I noted the task, the ask, the time the request landed, and the deadline. I added one line about what changed. I wrote it as if I were writing for a stranger who had to understand the day without hearing my tone. I also began to test small boundaries that are hard to spin as attitude. When a request came in after normal hours with a breathless subject line, I replied with a clear list of what I could complete that evening and what I would finish in the morning. Unless there was a documented client emergency, I asked for the client ticket number that described the emergency. Sometimes the emergency grew smaller when a number was required. I did not gloat. I saved the exchange. There were personal digs wrapped in feedback. My boss said I asked questions like a student rather than like a leader. She said I needed to show more executive presence when I asked her to define that. She said the phrase that is loved in unhelpful coaching, "You will know it when I see it." I wrote down that sentence word for word. I created a folder called Expectations and placed any message that moved the goalposts inside it. None of this was for revenge. It was for my own clarity. When you are told you are failing at something vague, you start to chase shadows. Documentation turns on the lights. The moment that made the path clear arrived on a morning that smelled like cold coffee and carpet cleaner. We sat in a one-to-one meeting and she said flatly that my performance had dipped. She said that people had concerns. I asked which people. She said it would be unprofessional to name them. I asked which metrics had dipped. She said the big picture was what mattered. Then she added a sentence that floated across the desk and landed like a wet cloth. If this does not improve, we may need to consider options. I thanked her for the feedback and asked for 3 things in writing: the concerns, the metrics, and the improvement plan. She looked annoyed and said that written plans are for formal cases. I said that a written plan would help me succeed. I smiled. I did not argue about fairness. I repeated that written expectations help me meet them. That afternoon, I sent a summary email. I wrote that during our meeting, she had raised performance concerns and discussed possible next steps. I wrote that I was eager to improve and requested a written list of goals, the metrics that would be used, and the timeline for review. I CC'd myself at my personal address using the company policy for backup copies that is meant for travel or off-site use. I stored the message in the folder that held my earlier notes. I knew I had crossed a small river. There is a tone some managers use when they expect you to drift away without noise. The tone does not love paper. At home, I read the handbook again. There is a path the company prefers when someone feels their manager is blocking fair evaluation or misrepresenting their work. The path starts with a conversation, then a written summary, then a request for a peer review of metrics, then a meeting with human resources if the previous steps fail. It recommends that the employee bring specific examples, propose a clear corrective plan, and avoid character statements. Stick to facts, show timestamps, show outcomes. I built a quiet packet. It included original drafts, edits with tracked changes, emails where credit shifted, and calendar entries that showed the rhythm of the late requests. I left out any line that sounded like a complaint about personality. I kept only the story the paper could tell. I also asked myself the question that keeps these stories from becoming a fistfight in prose. What do I actually want? I wanted a fair review. I wanted my work to reach the shared channels without being filtered through someone else's name. I wanted a schedule that could be respected. Promotion would be nice. But the win I could control was integrity. If I built the cleanest record I could, then whatever happened next would be honest. That became my quiet goal. Win or lose, it would be honest. The trigger was simple and sharp. A weekly meeting arrived where my boss presented the team's quarter plan to leadership. My process map sat at the center of the deck with her initials on the title slide. When questions came, she answered in a way that made it sound as if I had supported her brilliant idea. I did not interrupt. After the meeting, I sent a calm summary to her. I thanked her for presenting the plan and attached my original document with creation dates and the version history. I wrote that going forward I would like all work to live on the shared drive and include author names on the first page. I copied the project mailbox that the handbook recommends for documentation. My tone was steady and dry, the way you read out a weather report. She called me into a small room that afternoon. The first sentence out of her mouth was that I had a problem with tone. The second sentence was that people could not trust me with ownership. I asked which people. She said again that it would be unprofessional to name them. I asked which deliverables had raised concerns. She said the big picture mattered more than the details. Then she used the word options. If this does not improve, we may need to consider options. I repeated my request for a written plan with a short list of goals and dates. I said a plan in writing would help me succeed. I did not argue about credit. I did not defend my personality. I returned to paper. That evening I began sending end-of-day recaps that were almost boring. I listed what I had delivered, where the files lived, who was looped in, and what decisions were pending. I added one polite question at the bottom. Is there anything here you would like me to change? If she replied with a change, I made it and saved both versions. If she did not reply, I noted that too. When she asked for a late task, I responded with a list of what could be finished that night and what would be ready in the morning, unless there was a documented client emergency. I asked for the client ticket number. Sometimes the emergency went missing when a number was required. I never gloated. I saved the threads. There was pushback. She said my recaps were excessive. I said they were a temporary measure to make sure we were aligned. She said I was acting like a lawyer. I said I was acting like the handbook. She said I should trust her more. I said trust is helped by clarity. The room did not grow warmer, but the edges became visible. I stayed with nouns, verbs, dates, and shared locations. Facts are not a weapon when you hold them by the handle and not by the blade. I built a timeline that a stranger could follow. It began with my first month and the praise I had received. I included the messages where she told me I would go far. I included the first drafts she asked me to send to her private inbox for quality control. I showed the version histories that stopped at her mailbox and then reappeared in the deck under her credit. I added the client email that I had drafted, the one forwarded to the executive team with her line that she had written it herself. I compared the text. It matched like two halves of a ticket. I kept the language simple. This is the original. This is the forward. These are the times. This is the path the file took. Next came the mistakes. I pulled the tickets where an error appeared and traced the edit that introduced it. My original held the correct fields. Her revision had flipped them. I did not add adjectives. I did not add feelings. I let the tracked changes speak. I added the late-hour requests that landed near the end of the day and the reasonable replies I sent in return. I added the instances where she said an emergency existed and the moments when the emergency could not supply a reference number. I included the meeting where she said my performance had dipped and my summary email asking for a written plan. I noted that there was no plan in writing. I then took one more step that the handbook recommends. I asked for a peer review of my metrics. I wrote to the operations lead whose team receives my handoffs. I asked them to review the last quarter of my work for accuracy and timeliness. I said I welcomed notes on where I could improve. I copied my boss openly so that nothing looked secret. The operations lead replied with measured comments. There was one area I could tighten and two areas where my work had improved bottlenecks. I thanked them and attached the small fix as a file with instructions anyone could follow. I placed that exchange in the timeline as well. It proved that I was not only collecting problems, I was solving them. All of this lived in a clean folder with names that a future reader would not have to decipher. The top file was a one-page index that read like a table of contents. The second file was the timeline, one sentence per event. The rest were the receipts. No rants, no color, no flourishes. Paper tells the story when you let it breathe. The handbook has a ladder for escalation that does not jump steps. You speak. You summarize in writing. You request peer review when metrics are disputed. If those do not resolve the issue, you meet with human resources with a packet of facts, a proposed plan, and a clear statement of what a fair outcome would look like. I followed that ladder exactly. I sent my boss a short note saying that I had assembled the timeline and would appreciate a written improvement plan by the end of the week. I said the plan would help me hit goals that we both could see. I added that if we could not align in writing, I would request a meeting with human resources to help us formalize the plan. She replied with a message that felt like a smoke bomb. She wrote that my tone was insubordinate, that I was wasting time with paperwork, and that I was spreading negativity by copying other teams. She said that if I kept this up, I would make myself unemployable. I did not reply to the adjectives. I replied to the nouns. I wrote that I remained eager to meet measurable goals, that I welcomed a written plan, and that the peer review had offered helpful feedback, which I had already implemented. Then I gave her 48 hours and sent a calendar hold for a short check-in at the end of that window. I wrote that, if she preferred, I could invite human resources to help us build the plan together. She did not send a plan. She did not accept the meeting. She sent one last line about how leaders do not hide behind emails. That was enough. I wrote to human resources with a clear subject line, request for assistance, creating a documented improvement plan and aligning credit procedure. I kept the body of the note as simple as the index in my folder. I described my role. I described the concern in 3 sentences: credit misattribution, unmeasured performance feedback, and schedule pressure without documented emergencies. I attached the one-page index, the timeline, and a few representative receipts. I left out volume. I left out outrage. I asked for two things: a formal improvement plan with goals and dates, and a credit policy that requires author names and shared drive storage for all deliverables. Human Resources replied within a day and invited both of us to a meeting. The invitation used language that sounds like polished wood. They said they would partner with us to clarify expectations and ensure that processes support fair evaluation. I accepted. My boss accepted. In the hours before the meeting, she stopped by my desk and spoke quietly. She said that bringing human resources into a working relationship is a serious step. I said I agreed. And that is why I had tried each prior step first. I thanked her for meeting with me and said I would come with a proposal that would make her job easier. I meant it. A good process makes everyone's day less dramatic. The meeting began with pleasantries and water. I opened by saying I wanted to succeed and that I believed a written plan would help. I showed the index and said I would not walk through every document. I asked that we focus on a short list of goals, how we would measure them, and a simple credit policy for deliverables. My boss spoke in broad strokes about fit and presence and how teams need a single voice. Human Resources asked for examples. I handed over 3, one about credit, one about a repeated late-hour pattern, one about a disputed error. I walked through each quietly with receipts that fit on a single page. Human Resources asked my boss if there was a reason drafts were not saved to the shared drive. She said it saved time. Human Resources suggested that shared storage would save time for everyone. We agreed to create a written plan within the week. We agreed to author names on documents, shared drive storage, and clear subject lines for emergencies with client ticket numbers. Human Resources offered to act as a neutral checkpoint in 1 month. My boss smiled tightly and said she looked forward to our progress. I said thank you and meant it. I left the room with my packet lighter than when I entered. There was one more exchange that mattered. Later that day, my boss sent a message saying that she expected me to show more executive presence and to reduce the volume of emails. I replied with a short note. I would be glad to reduce recaps once the shared storage and author policy were in place. Until then, I would continue to send concise summaries for clarity. I added a sentence that I had learned to keep close. I am choosing boring process over dramatic conflict. It helped me hear my own voice. The days after that meeting felt like the air after a storm. Not perfectly clear, but breathable. Human Resources sent a short follow-up confirming what we had agreed. A written improvement plan within the week. Author names on the first page of every deliverable. Shared storage for drafts and finals. Client emergencies labeled with a ticket number in the subject line. My boss replied all with one sentence that said she supported the plan. That first afternoon, she forwarded me a deck and asked me to add 2 slides. I did the work, placed my name on the first page, saved it to the shared drive, and sent a link. She wrote back to say thank you. There was no sparkle. But there was also no attempt to route it through a private inbox. That counted as progress. The improvement plan arrived 2 days later. It listed 3 goals and the metrics for each: accuracy of handoffs, timeliness of deliverables, collaboration signals, which meant whether the right partners were looped in at the right moment. The timeline for review was 1 month. I read it twice and signed. I added a simple working note at the bottom. I would send 1 recap at the end of each day until the shared storage habit felt natural for the whole team. Then I would reduce the recaps to a weekly summary. I copied Human Resources so the expectation lived in writing. No one objected. Small ripples began to show. Late requests shrank. When something truly urgent appeared, it came with a client ticket number when it did not. I attached the work to the next morning's list and no one accused me of being unhelpful. The shared drive became normal. The first time my boss built a deck after the meeting. The title page carried both our names. I noticed it and said thank you. She nodded and moved on. There were no speeches. There was less friction. Here is a short commentary for anyone walking this road. Boring process is a shield that looks like glass. You see through it, you forget it is there, and then a stone hits, and you are grateful for the pain. End-of-day recaps. Shared storage. And author names feel stiff at first. Then they start saving everyone 10 minutes at a time. 10 minutes times a month is a small vacation. The best revenge at work is the habit that leaves no one confused. Halfway through the month, operations sent me a note. They had noticed the handoffs were cleaner and faster. One manager said a recurring bottleneck had disappeared. I placed those notes in the folder called Outcomes. I did not send them to anyone. I did not need to. They were part of the story the paper was telling. There were still moments that felt sticky. My boss once replied to a recap with a line about my tone. I answered with a single sentence that returned to facts. I listed the files and the decisions again and asked if she wanted any changes. She did not reply. The next morning, she approved the work inside the shared drive without comment. I took that as a quiet yes. The 1-month check-in with Human Resources arrived. We met in a room with a quiet clock. I brought a 1-page summary of the plan's goals and my results. Accuracy had improved because the shared drive kept edits from wandering. Timeliness was steady because late requests were now labeled properly. Collaboration was visible because the right partners were looped in from the first draft. Human Resources asked my boss for her view. She said the plan had helped and that the team was more aligned. She did not praise me. She did not need to. The numbers did the talking. The meeting ended with Human Resources suggesting that we keep the credit policy and shared storage as permanent habits and that they would check in again in another month. A week later, the director called me in. She said she had watched the quarter and liked the way I had stabilized a messy lane. She asked how I felt about leading a small process team that would help other groups adopt the same practices. It was not a confetti moment. It was quieter and better. It was a new chair at a slightly different table with a little more room to move. I said yes. Now the closure. I did not ruin my boss. I did not post a triumphant speech. I did not win a story that ends with grand gestures. I built a paper trail and a rhythm that made bad behavior inconvenient. I asked for a plan that anyone could see. I made it easier to do the right thing than the wrong thing. That is what I mean by a win that is safe for Human Resources. It is not flashy. It is repeatable. Here is the lesson I would hand you like a small tool. Write calmly. Store everything where it can be found. Ask for goals in writing. Ask for metrics that can be measured. When someone throws adjectives, answer with nouns. When someone threatens options, ask for a plan. When someone says leaders do not hide behind emails, say leaders love clarity even more. Decide what you actually want before you aim. If you want fairness, build a record that makes fairness easy to approve. If you want escape, build a record that makes exit clean. Let us close with a simple policy you can copy. In my work, I will use written channels for expectations and feedback. I will keep drafts and finals on shared storage. I will place author names and dates on the first page. I will send one clear recap at a cadence that respects attention. I will treat emergencies as real when they carry a reference number. I will seek peer review when metrics are disputed. I will ask for a formal plan when threats are made. This is not drama. This is design. If this workplace story gave you a steadier breath, vote in the poll and tell me what boring habit you will adopt first. Will it be the recap, the shared folder, the author line on page 1? Then subscribe and join me for the next calm win in the rain.